Ravensbrück camp experiments. If you were placed in a Nazi concentration camp during World War II, you are essentially in the worst living conditions possible. But Jewish women were not only suffering in concentration camps, but were forced to become test subjects as well. Ravensbrück was a concentration camp exclusively for women. Because women were more vulnerable than men, they became the perfect targets for Nazi experiments during the war. These tests involved antibiotics and bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration experiments. Specifically, the antibiotic used was sulfonamide. The Nazis were using Jewish women to know whether or not this drug was useful for treating infections. That means that they deliberately infected women with bacteria by wounding them, essentially simulating battlefield injuries and rubbing dirt on them. They treated some of the wounded with the antibiotic. Meanwhile, other wounded women were left untreated so that they could compare the results. This caused incredible pain, severe infections, and death, especially among the women who were left untreated. The other set of experiments involved cutting out bones, muscles, or nerves from the imprisoned woman and then transplanting them to another person to see if they would heal. Essentially, they were trying out Frankenstein-like experiments, and they did it without any anesthesia at all. You could imagine the pain these prisoners went through. Many victims were left disabled or dead. Of course, the experiments only ended after the fall of the Nazi Germans at the end of World War II. Some women survived these experiments, but were left with scars and severe health issues. Malaria therapy experiments. During the earlier part of the 20th century, some guy had a crazy idea of curing an illness with another illness, like fighting fire with fire. That's what happened in Julius Wagner Jareg's malaria therapy experiments. At that time, treating mental illnesses was still experimental, and some doctors went to the extreme to find treatments. Wagner Jareg was one of those dudes. He noticed that high fevers can sometimes alleviate certain mental illnesses, like neurosyphilis. So what he did was to infect prisoners suffering from neurosyphilis with malaria. It was like adding more fuel to the fire, because he was adding more illnesses to patients who were already sick. His logic was questionable, but it made sense at that time because doctors were desperate to find a cure for this condition. Malaria causes high fevers, which could produce enough body heat to treat the illness. Some patients showed temporary improvement in symptoms. However, most patients never completely recovered from neurosyphilis or even from malaria. A lot of patients didn't even survive the malaria treatment, while others suffered serious complications. In fact, 15% of his patients died. Interestingly, Wagner Jareg won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1927. That's because, as crazy as this experiment was, doctors were more interested in finding a cure to mental illnesses than caring about how many people died along the way. Sensory deprivation experiments. In the 1950s, a Canadian psychological researcher must have said to himself, I wonder how crazy people would get if they're under extreme isolation. That was how his sensory deprivation experiments came about. Initially, Dr. Donald Hebb conducted the study in a small soundproof cubicle. His subjects wore goggles, a U-shaped pillow, and thick gloves, so the sensory receptors in their hands would be blocked. The goal was to see how the brain would react to this situation. Eventually, he thought about moving his experiments to Canadian prisons because it was easier to conduct tests on people deprived of freedom. Of course, if you were a prisoner back then, you probably didn't have much choice but to agree to join the experiment, especially if you're offered a few incentives. It's like someone asked you out on a date a day after breaking up with your ex. You're vulnerable enough to say yes. So because of that, the inmates agreed, without full consent or understanding, to take part in the sensory deprivation experiment. They were isolated in small cells for days and weeks without using their senses. Hebb used the same materials he used in his previous experiments, only this time he could keep the prisoners isolated for a long time without anyone telling him no. In the end, a lot of those inmates almost went crazy. Some of them experienced severe anxiety, while others started hallucinating. The other inmates were hearing voices, seeing strange patterns, and failing to understand what was real and imaginary. Of course, these researchers could only conduct those experiments because ethical standards back then were almost non-existent. However, the experiment did indeed allow the researchers to conclude that prolonged sensory deprivation could cause severe psychological harm. Stateville malaria experiments. You're an American soldier during World War II, and you feel invincible because you've defeated every enemy force in the tropical regions of the Pacific. You notice that this small insect bites you and your fellow soldiers. Suddenly, you and everyone else around you got sick with malaria. That's when the US realized that mosquitoes were their biggest problem in the Pacific. Doctors from the University of Chicago wanted to find a cure for malaria to stop the threat, but the only available resource they had at that time were prison inmates from the Stateville Penitentiary. These researchers said, let's experiment on these prisoners. No one's going to know. So what they did was they deliberately exposed the inmates to mosquitoes carrying the malaria parasite to make them ill. After that, they tested various drugs on them to see which ones effectively cure malaria. Of course, the prisoners weren't actually unwilling test subjects. They were offered incentives, such as shorter sentences and better living spaces in the prison. But if you were in their place, you didn't have a choice at all. It was choosing between life in a hellish prison for eternity and becoming a guinea pig in exchange for a few perks. The experiment led to some important breakthroughs about malaria, allowing the doctors to discover an effective treatment. Meanwhile, the prisoners suffered health problems as a result of the experiments. One inmate even suffered 2 heart attacks before his eventual death. Dachau camp experiments. If you place the craziest and most sadistic Nazi scientists in a concentration camp, you're bound to get the most insane experiments. That's what happened during the Dachau concentration camp experiments during World War II. One of the most disturbing tests involved testing how long a person could survive in freezing water. This means taking a prisoner and immersing them in tanks full of ice-cold water and waiting until they freeze to death. Another experiment was keeping prisoners in freezing rooms for hours to see how long until hypothermia would set in and how their bodies would react to such conditions. All these experiments were sanctioned by the Nazi German government so that they would know the limits of the human body. Of course, these tests were not random experiments. The Nazis, realizing that they needed to fight the Russians in freezing climates, were looking for ways to know how long their soldiers would last in those regions. It just so happened that they thought that the Jews in their concentration camp were disposable resources that they could use to test out their theories. It goes without saying that those who were subjected to those harsh experiments most likely never lived to tell the tale. However, the few survivors would have been left with severe physical and mental scars that affected them their entire lives. Prison cancer cells study. If a 1950s doctor wanted to know how certain viruses and illnesses would affect people, the first place they would go to was a prison. Dr. Chester Southam, a researcher, had the idea when he said to himself, maybe I should test out my cancer theory on inmates. I mean, no one's going to miss them, right? So what he did was he went to the Ohio State Penitentiary to conduct his cancer research. But instead of telling the head of the prison the truth, he told them that he was there to find a cure for cancer. Of course, he wasn't trying to find a cure for cancer, but was merely looking at what would happen to a healthy person's body if cancer cells entered their system. While he was there, he injected unknowing prison inmates with cancer cells without telling them what they were. He merely fooled them by saying, "Hey, we're giving you human cells grown in a test tube," instead of actually telling them the truth. But he tried to justify his lie by saying that he wanted to get rid of the phobia surrounding the word cancer. The prisoners' bodies fought off the cancer cells, and that means that none of the test subjects developed cancer. But Southam was eventually suspended for a year after he was found guilty of fraud, deceit, and unprofessional conduct for his actions in the Ohio State Penitentiary. Bilibid vaccination experiments. The Philippines sounds like a great place to live in, unless you're a criminal behind bars, because you'll be stuffed inside Bilibid, one of the most overcrowded prisons there is. So during the early 1900s, when the Philippines was still under American control, researchers thought that they could use Bilibid as a testing ground. At that time, there were a lot of deadly diseases that plagued the world. This included smallpox, cholera, and the plague. However, because American researchers thought that American lives were more important than Filipino lives, they tested vaccines on Bilibid inmates, as there were literally thousands of prisoners cramped in one place. But some of the prisoners were just in there for minor offenses, like stealing, littering, and stuff like that. Still, they became unwilling participants in medical trials that affected their health. Let's say that you were there for pickpocketing, but you suddenly find yourself getting poked by needles full of drugs on your first day in prison. The worst part was that these vaccines were still experimental, making it clear that the doctors weren't aware of how they could affect the inmates. Some prisoners suffered severe side effects. while others died of complications linked to the experiments. It was estimated that 13 of the 24 inmates who suffered the plague died, as the experiment had to end due to the rising death toll. We on this channel are also looking for prisoners of society for a series of experiments. You can volunteer by joining our Discord. We promise there will be snacks and candy. Thalidomide experiments. In the 1950s and 60s, if you were feeling a bit dizzy after a long night of drinking, you'd pop a thalidomide pill right away. However, this pill had a dark secret that involved its effects and how it was produced. Barely a decade after World War II, a former Nazi chemist and a few other Nazi scientists were in charge of developing thalidomide. Yeah, they hired Nazis to work on a drug as if these guys weren't responsible for a lot of war crimes. It turned out that the early history of thalidomide started during World War II when the Nazi scientists were still experimenting on prisoners. At that time, the Nazis were testing numerous drugs and vaccines, including Contagion, one of the earliest forms of thalidomide. These drugs were tested on women prisoners of war in various concentration camps. Many women suffered from health problems and other complications before the Nazis got the formula right. Most of those women survived the experiments, only for them to get killed in gas chambers before the end of the war. By the time thalidomide was ready for the market, millions of people started using it. However, it turned out that while it was effective at treating headaches and morning sickness among pregnant women, it caused birth deformities. The drugs may have been tested on pregnant women in concentration camps, but none of them lived long enough to give birth. That's why the scientists didn't know that thalidomide could cause birth defects. San Quentin experiments. During the 1930s, doctors were wondering how long a person would take to die if they were exposed to a deadly gas. After all, a biological attack could happen at any moment. That's why some researchers were looking into the effects of deadly gases like hydrogen cyanide in case enemy countries were to use it against America. The researchers looked at the San Quentin prison in California and said, that's a place full of people who might be willing to get exposed to deadly gas. So these scientists went to San Quentin and asked for volunteers, promising reduced sentences if they agreed to participate. So if you were one of the prisoners back then, you'd probably get excited about the opportunity to get back home earlier than expected. You're probably like, it's just gas, nothing can go wrong. However, the researchers never expected anyone to survive because they wanted to tell how long a person would take to die when exposed to hydrogen cyanide. As a result, as the prisoners kicked the bucket, researchers observed how their bodies were reacting. So instead of a reduced prison sentence, you'll get a one-way ticket to the grave. The gas chamber eventually became an execution method for inmates at San Quentin, but since 1996, the gas chamber is no longer in use as the prison got rid of executions. ECT experiments. Let's put you in the shoes of a prisoner during the 1940s, when doctors were still understanding mental health issues and how to treat them. Back then, these researchers were interested in how electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, could be used for treating mental disorders. So the first people they saw were prisoners, because a lot of psychiatrists believed that prison inmates had mental illnesses. ECT basically involves sending electric currents through your brain. Researchers back then thought that they could use it to shock the brain into curing depression, sleep deprivation, and schizophrenia. So in an attempt to reintegrate sick prisoners into the workforce, scientists use this treatment on them. While ECT is currently generally accepted in helping people with mental illnesses, these experiments were done without any care for the prisoners. The inmates were deprived of sleep and given high doses of drugs. Some of those prisoners were actually healthy and had no mental illnesses. The experiment was successful in allowing scientists to understand how ECT can treat mental illnesses. However, the prisoners who were forced to take part in the trials were left psychologically scarred because of the harsh experiments done on them. CIA torture experiments. If you were in America during the early 2000s, you'd know how tense the situation was because of the war with Iraq and the many different terrorist attacks going on. You were probably even a bit paranoid. Of course, the guys over at the CIA were just as paranoid as anyone else. Tasked with diving deep into the heart of the terrorist movements all over the world, the CIA developed enhanced interrogation techniques that involved experimenting on different terrorist suspects. Such experiments involved waterboarding, sleep deprivation, and physical attacks, which were all designed to extract information from possible terrorist prisoners. The CIA, of course, justified these cruel experiments and techniques. We were only doing this to prevent another terrorist attack. So instead of playing good cop, bad cop, the CIA agents were playing bad cop the entire time, using brutal methods and techniques in their experiments to understand which methods were the best at getting detainees to squeal. After all, people would do anything to stop the pain. However, the problem with this method is that it wasn't entirely effective at extracting the truth. In one instance, a suspected high-ranking terrorist was waterboarded 83 times before he gave the CIA what they wanted to know. It turned out, however, that this dude lied the entire time and gave false information to the CIA. He and all of the other suspects are still detained in maximum security prisons. In 2014, the truth came out as people all over the world found out how abusive the CIA was in gathering intelligence. This led to reforms that ultimately led to more humane methods of information extraction. Still, we can only imagine what the CIA is currently doing to prisoners and suspects over at Guantanamo Bay.